Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. Settle in, find your most comfortable position, and let the world outside grow quiet around you. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolds not on rooftops or in the skies above Manhattan, but in the hum of a press room, behind the glass of an editor's office, and across decades of ink and conviction. It is the story of a war waged with words rather than weapons, between a man who sat behind a desk and believed with every fibre of his being that he was protecting his city, and a hero who swung through the night and asked for nothing in return except the chance to help. There is no need to follow every detail or remember every name. Simply let the story carry you, the way a river carries a leaf, gently and without effort through the long and complicated and deeply human history of the Daily Bugle's crusade against the amazing Spider-Man. There is a building on the corner of a busy Manhattan street that has stood through decades of change and remained in some essential way exactly what it has always been. The stone of its facade has darkened with the years, and the windows of its upper floors catch the last of the afternoon light and hold it briefly before the city turns toward evening. At street level, the foot traffic moves past without stopping, the way people always move past the things they depend upon most, without ceremony, without pause, the way a neighbourhood takes for granted the bakery that has been there since before anyone can remember, or the park bench that has always been exactly where it is needed. The Daily Bugle is like that. It is part of the texture of New York, woven into the city the way the bridges are woven into it, so fundamental that its absence would change the shape of everything, though most of the people who buy it each morning on their way to work could not tell you precisely when it was founded, or who first pressed its first edition into the hands of the city's earliest readers. Inside, particularly at certain hours of the day and night, the building has a smell that is entirely its own. It is the smell of newsprint and machine oil, of the particular kind of coffee that is brewed in large institutional quantities and kept warm for too long, of cigarette smoke absorbed into walls over many years until it becomes something more permanent than smoke, more like a mineral quality of the air itself. The printing presses in the basement levels are the heartbeat of the building, felt as much as heard. A deep rhythmic vibration that travels up through the floors and into the soles of the feet of anyone who stands still long enough to notice it. When the presses are running at full capacity before a major edition, the whole building seems to breathe with them, expanding and contracting in some slow, mechanical respiration that the staff barely notices anymore. The way you stop noticing the sound of your own heartbeat, unless you lie very still in a quiet room and listen for it. The press room itself, where the pages come together and the final decisions are made about what the city will read the following morning, has a controlled frenzy to it that is really, upon closer inspection, a kind of order. There are desks covered in paper, in carbon copies and galley proofs and photographs waiting to be selected or discarded. There are telephones that ring and are answered in the same motion, conversations completed in half sentences between people who have worked together long enough to require very few full thoughts to communicate. There are young reporters sitting at their machines with the particular posture of people trying to think and type at the same time, slightly hunched, slightly urgent. The fingers moving and then stopping and then moving again. And above it all, behind the glass walls of his corner office, there is the publisher. The Daily Bugle was established in the 1880s, during a period when New York was growing faster than any city had grown before, when the streets below what would become the city's great towers were still unpaved in places, when the boroughs were still becoming what they would be, when the population was absorbing wave after wave of new arrivals who stepped off boats into a city that did not yet know quite what it would become. Newspapers in that era were instruments of tremendous power and tremendous irresponsibility, in roughly equal measure. They made careers and destroyed them. They started conversations that shaped elections and ended conversations that might have prevented conflicts. They reflected the city back to itself with varying degrees of accuracy and varying degrees of agenda, and the people who read them were sophisticated enough about this, in the way that long experience teaches sophistication, to take what they needed and discard the rest. The Bugle survived the decades that followed by doing what all durable institutions do, which is to change in the ways that are necessary, while maintaining the quality that made it worth preserving. It survived the transition from hot lead type to cold type, survived the shifts in advertising that restructured the economics of print journalism, survived the deaths and retirements of editors who had shaped its character for a generation, and the arrivals of new editors who brought new priorities. It covered both world wars from its desks and its distant correspondence, covered the Depression with a seriousness of purpose that earned it a particular loyalty from the borough readers who needed a newspaper that took their suffering seriously, covered the post-war boom with an energy that matched the city's own optimism. Through all of it, the building on that corner of Manhattan remained, and the presses in the basement continued their deep, felt vibration. And the coffee continued to be brewed in institutional quantities and kept warm for too long. By the 1960s, when the story we are tracing tonight truly begins to take its defining shape, the Daily Bugle had settled into a particular identity that reflected both its history and the convictions of the man who had come to define it. It was not the most prestigious paper in the city, not the paper that the people in certain offices and certain drawing rooms read first thing in the morning with their glasses on and their minds open to nuance and complexity. It was the paper that the city read, the paper that was bought from the stand on the corner and folded under the arm on the subway and spread across the kitchen table while the coffee was being poured. The paper that spoke to New Yorkers about New York in the language of people who had always lived there and expected to go on living there. It took its role seriously. It understood itself as a watchdog, as a voice for the ordinary citizen against the powerful institution, as the place where a reader could find not just the news but the meaning of the news, the interpretation, the outrage or the celebration or the warning that the reader might not have the time or the resources to arrive at independently. This sense of civic purpose was not simply a marketing position or an editorial policy decided at a quarterly meeting. It was something genuinely felt, something that had been built into the culture of the place through the choices and characters of the people who had worked there over the decades. The reporters who came up through the Bugle, who learnt their craft in its press room and on its beats and in its editor's office, tended to emerge with a particular quality of conviction. They believed in the function of the press. They believed that what they did mattered, that the information they gathered and the words they chose and the headlines they wrote shaped the understanding of a city of millions in ways that carried real consequences for real people. This was a belief that could become an earnest and admirable driver of important journalism, and it was also a belief that, carried too far, unchecked by the normal human processes of doubt and revision, could become something more like a closed system, a confirmation of whatever the person already believed the world to be. That particular quality of conviction, the strength and the shadow of it, was nowhere more fully embodied in the Daily Bugle than in the man who had risen to its editorship and eventually to its ownership. He had made the paper his, not simply in the legal sense of proprietorship, but in the deeper sense of having impressed his personality so thoroughly upon its culture that the two had become difficult to separate. The Daily Bugle and Jay. Jonah Jameson were, by the time our story reaches its central drama, very nearly the same thing. And to understand what the Bugle said about Spider-Man across the years that followed, and why it said it with such consistency and such force, it is necessary to understand the man himself, to follow the thread of his life back to its origins and to find there the recognizable human material from which his great certainty was made. There is a moment, very late on certain nights in the press room, when the last of the deadlines has been met and the pages have been sent and the building exhales, very slowly, like a person setting down a heavy thing they have been carrying all day. The reporters begin to gather their coats. The phones ring less urgently. The particular quality of the light changes, softening from the harsh practical brightness of a working room to something more reflective and still. In these moments, if you knew where to look and were inclined to be quiet enough to observe without intruding, you might see the outline of the publisher through the glass of his corner office, still at his desk, a single lamp lit, the city spread out behind him through the windows like a dark geography of lights, and you would understand, in that image, something essential about the relationship between one man's need to speak and the city's vast, indifferent beloved. Endlessly complicated life, that is where tonight's story lives, in the space between the lamp in the editor's office and the darkness outside, in the long years of ink and conviction, in the complicated, ultimately very human question of what it means to be certain you are right, to give everything you have to that certainty, and to discover very slowly and very late that the world was larger than the story you told about it. the man behind the desk did not begin behind a desk. He began, as most people begin, in circumstances that gave no particular indication of the figure he would eventually become, in a world that was smaller and quieter than the one he would spend his life trying to hold accountable. Joseph Jonah Jameson was born in the early decades of the 20th century, into a New York that was still learning what it was going to be, a city of neighborhoods that functioned almost as separate villages, each with its own particular character and rhythm, its own grocery stores and gathering places and unspoken rules about how people were expected to treat one another. The Jameson family was not wealthy. They were the kind of people who managed, who found ways to make things work through a combination of discipline and pride, and a particular unwillingness to complain about the things that could not be changed. These qualities, absorbed in childhood the way all the most formative things are absorbed, without conscious decision, simply through the long accumulation of daily example, would remain visible in Jonah Jameson for the rest of his life. His father was a man of the kind of quiet, undemonstrative integrity that is sometimes more powerful in its influence than any amount of explicit instruction. He worked hard at jobs that did not reward him generously, and came home without bitterness, and treated the people around him with a consistency of respect that his son watched, and, in the way that children watch the things that matter most, filed away somewhere deeper than memory. There were difficulties in those years, the particular difficulties of families living through the Depression and its aftermath, the experience of scarcity that leaves a permanent mark on the people who move through it, a mark that tends to express itself not as fear of want, but as a ferocious appreciation for the things that are genuinely earned. Jonah Jameson would carry that mark for the rest of his life. It showed in the way he worked, in the impatience he felt toward what he perceived as laziness or entitlement, in the standard he held himself to and extended, not always fairly, to everyone around him. He discovered journalism the way certain people discover a vocation, not as a conscious career choice, but as the recognition of something that had always been true about them. He was a teenager when he first walked into the offices of a small local paper and offered himself as a copy boy, and what he felt in that building, the purposefulness of it, the sense that words were being used for something that mattered, that the information being gathered and shaped and sent out into the world had the capacity to change things, was something close to what other people describe feeling in places of worship. There was a rightness to it. The noise and the urgency and the particular quality of concentration that a newsroom produces, a kind of collective focus that is unlike the atmosphere of any other kind of workplace, settled around him like something he had been looking for without knowing he was looking. He was not a naturally graceful writer. He worked at it the way he worked at everything, with a stubbornness that gradually became skill, and what he developed over the years was a style that was not elegant in the literary sense, but was enormously effective in the journalistic one. He wrote the way he spoke, directly and without apology, in sentences that said exactly what they meant and moved on. His editors liked him because he met deadlines and got the facts right and never had to be asked twice for something. His colleagues liked him rather less consistently, because he had a quality that sat somewhere between confidence and certainty, that could be exhilarating when it was pointed in the right direction, and exhausting when it was not. He was the person in a room who always had a position, who was never in the process of forming an opinion but always already in possession of one, and while this made him exceptionally effective as an advocate journalist, it sometimes made him a difficult companion. The early years of his career were genuinely distinguished. This is worth holding on to, worth understanding clearly, because it is easy, when you know what Jameson eventually became in relation to Spider-Man, to read his history backwards, to find in his early life only the seeds of his later excesses, and to miss the real achievements that preceded them. The truth is that Jonah Jameson, in the first decades of his journalism career, did work that mattered. He wrote about corruption in city contracting, at a time when doing so carried real professional risk. He published editorials about police brutality in communities of colour, when the mainstream press was largely uninterested in those stories. He ran investigations into labour practices in manufacturing facilities that led to genuine legislative consequences, to safer conditions for workers who had no other advocates in the press. He was, in the fullest and most legitimate sense of the word, a crusader, someone who understood the press as a mechanism for speaking power to account, and who used that mechanism with considerable skill and genuine moral seriousness. The women and men who worked for him in those years, who sat in the press room and felt the vibration of the presses beneath their feet and wrote their stories under his demanding and not always patient editorship, would say, even those who found him most difficult, that he genuinely believed in what he was doing. That was the thing about Jameson. Whatever you thought of his methods or his judgments, there was no cynicism at the centre of him. He was not performing conviction. He was not building a brand or cultivating a persona. He was, in the most old-fashioned and perhaps most admirable sense, a true believer in the function of the press and in his own obligation to exercise it with maximum force and minimum compromise. This made him, at his best, genuinely formidable, and it would make him, at his most obsessive, genuinely dangerous in ways that he would not fully reckon with for a very long time. His first marriage to a woman named Joan belongs to the part of Jameson's story that he carried quietly, that did not make its way into his editorials or his public positions, but that shaped everything about him in the way that private losses shape public people, invisibly and completely. Joan was, by all accounts of those who knew them together, a woman of genuine warmth and moral seriousness, who complemented her husband's ferocity with a quality of gentleness that he could not easily produce in himself. She saw through his bluster to the person underneath it, the person who was, beneath all the certainty and the volume, someone who cared perhaps too much, who felt the injustices of the world with an intensity that the bluster was partly designed to manage. She died young, and the loss of her left a space in Jonah Jameson's interior life that he filled, as people who are not naturally contemplative tend to fill such spaces, with more work, more conviction, more noise. Their son, John, grew up in the particular circumstances of a child raised by a single father, who expressed love primarily through expectation. The dynamic between them was complicated in the way that the dynamics between fathers who expect much and sons who want most to be seen clearly tend to be complicated. John Jameson grew into a man of remarkable capability and genuine courage. He became a test pilot and then an astronaut. One of the earliest of that extraordinary generation of Americans who agreed to be placed inside metal vessels and flung toward the boundary of the atmosphere with the full knowledge that the technology making this possible was still very new and very imperfectly understood. His father was proud of him in a way that expressed itself as pride in the conventional virtues his son embodied, rather than as the simpler, quieter pride that John perhaps wanted more. John was brave and he was open, and he put his name and his face on his courage, and Jonah could point to him and say, "There, that is what a hero looks like. A hero is accountable. A hero stands in the light and says, 'I am responsible for what I do.' This is the sentence, or something very like it, that sits at the root of everything that followed. The argument that Jonah Jameson would one day make against Spider-Man. With all the force of his considerable personality and all the resources of his newspaper, was not, at its deepest level, an argument about whether Spider-Man was helpful or harmful, brave or reckless, motivated by good intentions or bad ones. It was an argument about accountability, about the difference between the kind of courage that puts its face forward and the kind that hides behind a mask, about whether a society should celebrate, or even tolerate, people who claim the authority to act on its behalf without submitting to any of the normal mechanisms by which authority is granted and held to account. These were not trivial questions. They were questions that a serious, principled person engaged with the workings of democratic society might genuinely ask. The fact that they were, in Jameson's case, also questions through which his personal psychology found expression, his distrust of hidden power, his need to understand and categorize the forces operating in his city, his son's heroism providing a constant implicit contrast, does not make them less serious questions. It only makes them more human ones. More recognizably, the kind of questions that emerge not from pure philosophical inquiry, but from the specific mixture of experience and character and private grief that each of us brings to the things we care most about. The New York into which Spider-Man first appeared was Jameson's city in a way that very few cities belong very fully to any one person. He had reported on it and editorialized about it and argued on its behalf for decades. He knew its corruption and its generosity, its capacity for reinvention, and its stubborn attachment to the familiar. He had watched it change, and had sometimes welcomed the change, and sometimes resisted it, and had never, through any of it, stopped caring about it with the fierce, almost physical love that long residence in a great city can produce. When something new appeared in that city, something that operated outside the frameworks he understood, something powerful and anonymous that seemed to attract public celebration, without having earned, in his view, the right to that celebration, his reaction was not simple hostility. It was the reaction of someone who had spent a lifetime thinking carefully about power and accountability, encountering something that challenged his framework in ways he found genuinely troubling. He was not, in those first months, certain of his position. There are indications, in the early coverage of Spider-Man in the Bugle's pages, of a genuine ambivalence, a real effort to weigh what was being reported before arriving at a judgment. The editorials that came later, with their absolute certainty and their rhetorical force, grew from something that began more tentatively, as a question rather than a conclusion. But Jonah Jameson was not a man who found it easy to remain in the territory of the question. His mind moved toward positions the way water moves toward low ground, following the channels of his existing beliefs, gathering momentum as it went, arriving at conclusions with a force that made them feel inevitable even when the path to them had been more complicated than they appeared in retrospect. What he brought to his first real consideration of Spider-Man, then, was the full weight of a lifetime, the integrity he had learned from his father, the conviction he had built through years of important journalism, the grief he carried quietly from the loss of his wife, the pride he felt in a son who was everything an open, accountable hero was supposed to be, the city he loved and felt responsible for in the peculiar way that editors of newspapers that speak for cities feel responsible. These things did not make what followed inevitable. People carry heavy things and make choices that transcend the weight of them, but they made it comprehensible, and that comprehension is what tonight's story is really asking us to find. Not the simple verdict on a man who was wrong about something important, but the more difficult and more human understanding of how a good person, given a particular life and a particular set of convictions and a particular set of losses, can arrive at a position that causes real harm while believing with complete sincerity that they are doing the opposite. The lamp in the corner office burned late most nights. The city spread itself out beyond the windows in its vast indifferent beauty. And at the desk, surrounded by the evidence of decades of purposeful work, a complicated man was in the process of forming the opinion that would define the remaining arc of his life, bring him into conflict with a hero he could not fully understand, and eventually, very slowly and at considerable cost, bring him to a reckoning with everything he thought he knew. The city noticed him before it understood him, which is the way cities tend to notice most things that matter. There was no announcement, no press conference, no official introduction of the sort that might have allowed people to place him in one of the existing categories their minds had prepared for unusual things. He simply appeared, the way certain changes appear in a familiar landscape, noticed first at the periphery of attention, in a half-heard conversation on a subway platform or a brief item buried in the middle pages of an afternoon edition, before gradually becoming something that could no longer be ignored or explained away or filed under the ordinary headings that people use to manage the extraordinary. The first confirmed sightings of Spider-Man in the streets and skies above New York City occurred in the early months of 1962, and they produced, in the people who witnessed them directly, a quality of response that was difficult to articulate, and that varied considerably depending on the particular circumstances of the encounter. A woman who watched from her apartment window as a figure in red and blue swung between the buildings of her street on lines of something that appeared to be silk described the experience later as dreamlike, as though the boundary between the ordinary world and some other, more elastic version of it had briefly become permeable. A dock worker who watched Spider-Man apprehend two men in the process of stealing cargo from a warehouse on the waterfront used simpler language. He said it was the strangest thing he had ever seen, and that the strangest part was not the climbing or the webs or the impossible agility, but the fact that when it was over, the figure simply left, without waiting for thanks or recognition, or the arrival of the police, disappearing upward into the shadows between buildings as though what had just happened was entirely unremarkable. This quality of the departure, the refusal of acknowledgement, the absence of any claim on the gratitude or attention of the people who had just been helped, was something that people returned to again and again in those early accounts. It was not what anyone expected from someone with abilities of that magnitude. The stories that people grew up reading, the popular culture of heroism that had shaped everyone's sense of what a heroic figure ought to look and behave like, tended to feature heroes who were present in their heroism, who stood in the light of what they had done and allowed the world to see them clearly. This one did not. This one helped, and then vanished, and the vanishing was as remarkable in its own quieter way as everything that had preceded it. The New York press, which prided itself on being the first to understand what was happening in the city it covered, found Spider-Man genuinely difficult to manage in those early weeks. The normal mechanisms of journalism, the sources cultivated over years, the official channels through which information about unusual events was supposed to flow, the press conferences and police briefings and institutional statements that gave reporters something concrete to anchor their stories to, were entirely absent. There was no Spider-Man spokesperson. There was no official position on Spider-Man from the police department, which was itself still working out what it thought about the situation. There were only the accounts of witnesses, fragmentary and contradictory and coloured by the particular emotional state of the person giving them, and the evidence left behind at the scenes of his interventions, which was itself strange and unprecedented. The silken webbing that adhered to surfaces with extraordinary strength, and then dissolved after a matter of hours, leaving behind nothing that a laboratory could do very much with. The early coverage in most of the city's papers was cautious and curious in roughly equal measure. Reporters wrote about Spider-Man the way they might write about an unusual weather event or an unexplained natural phenomenon, cataloguing the observable facts with varying degrees of confidence and resisting, for the most part, the temptation to arrive too quickly at a verdict. The public seemed to want a verdict, or at least a framework, some way of understanding what this thing was and what it meant for the city they lived in. But the facts available were not yet sufficient to support one with any confidence, and the better journalists of that period understood that the space between observation and conclusion was exactly the space that responsible reporting was supposed to occupy. At the Daily Bugle, the initial editorial response to reports of Spider-Man was shaped by the same professional instincts and the same practical difficulties that affected coverage everywhere else. But it was also shaped, from the very beginning, by the particular sensibility of its publisher. Jonah Jameson read the early accounts with the particular quality of attention he brought to anything that touched on questions of power and authority in his city, the focused, slightly narrowed attention of someone who is not simply gathering information, but testing it against a framework that is already in place. What he read produced in him not the wonder or the simple admiration that the same accounts produced in many of the people who read them, but a kind of unease that he was, in those first weeks, still in the process of understanding and articulating. The unease was not, at this stage, hostility. It is important to be precise about that, because the story of how Jameson's position hardened over the months and years that followed is a story that begins in a place that is more nuanced and more defensible than where it eventually arrived. What Jameson felt in those early weeks was something closer to the professional discomfort of a journalist who has encountered a story that resists the normal tools of verification and accountability. He could not find Spider-Man. He could not interview him, or profile him, or subject him to the kind of scrutiny that Jameson believed any figure operating in the public sphere owed to the public. The mask, which to many observers seemed a minor detail or even an appealing element of the mystery, struck Jameson as something more fundamental. It was a refusal, a deliberate withholding of the most basic information that any citizen acting on behalf of other citizens ought to be willing to provide. The question he began to ask in those early weeks, first privately and then in the editorial meetings where the Bugle's coverage direction was decided, was a question that sounded reasonable because it was reasonable, or at least it had its roots in something reasonable. The question was simply, who is this person and who gave them the right? Not who is Spider-Man, in the sense of demanding the secret identity that lay beneath the mask, though that dimension would develop later. But who is the person, with what training and what accountability and what recourse for the public in the event of mistakes, that has decided to take on the role of protector in the streets of New York City without any of the normal mechanisms of authorization and oversight that the city required of everyone else who claimed to act on its behalf? These were questions that a thoughtful person could sit with for a while, turning them over, examining them from different angles, acknowledging their legitimacy while also acknowledging the complexity of the situation they were addressed to. They were questions that might, in a different temperament or a different set of circumstances, have led to a body of journalism that grappled seriously and productively with the genuine tensions between individual heroism and democratic accountability. In Jonah Jameson's hands, as the weeks became months and the early uncertainty hardened into conviction, they became something different. But they did not begin as something different. They began as genuine inquiry, and that origin is part of what made the position they eventually supported so difficult to simply dismiss. The police department's response to Spider-Man during this early period was itself divided in ways that reflected the genuine complexity of the situation. There were officers, particularly those who had been present at scenes where Spider-Man had intervened, who were privately and sometimes openly appreciative of what he had done. The practicalities of policing a city like New York, with its density and its crime rate and its perpetual gap between the resources available and the problems requiring attention, meant that effective assistance was effective assistance, and the people who had seen Spider-Man in action tended to have a more pragmatic attitude toward the question of his authorization than those who had only read about him. But there were also officers and supervisors and eventually official voices within the department who shared something of Jameson's discomfort, who felt that the presence of an unaccountable figure operating in the same spaces where they operated created problems of jurisdiction and liability and public expectation that would eventually need to be addressed. The early Bugle coverage of Spider-Man, in those first months before the editorial position had calcified into Crusade, reflected this ambivalence in ways that are worth noticing. There were straight news stories that reported his interventions without editorial colouring, that documented what he had done and what witnesses had said and what the police had said, and allowed the reader to form their own assessment. There were pieces that explored the public reaction with genuine curiosity, that captured the range of opinion, the wonder and the unease and the simple gratitude of people whose lives had been directly affected by his presence. The Bugle was, in this early period, still in the process of deciding what it thought, still allowing the evidence to accumulate before bringing the full force of its editorial personality to bear. What changed this, what began the shift from uncertainty to conviction, was not a single dramatic event but a gradual accumulation of incidents and interpretations, each one adding a small weight to the side of the scale that Jameson was already inclined to load. There were moments when Spider-Man's interventions resulted in property damage, moments when the collateral effects of his battles with criminals left behind broken windows and cracked pavements and frightened bystanders who had not chosen to be part of whatever was happening around them. There were moments when the police arrived at a scene that Spider-Man had already left and found themselves with a situation that was not entirely straightforward, with criminals who had been subdued in ways that left questions about the degree of force used and the appropriateness of the method. None of these incidents were, in isolation, particularly damning. They were the normal texture of imperfect heroism in a complicated urban environment, the kind of thing that any sufficiently attentive observer would expect from someone who was, after all, working out how to do something that had never been done before. But they provided Jameson with what he needed to begin moving from question to position, and once he began that movement, the trajectory was, given everything he was and everything he believed, almost impossible to reverse. The first editorial in the Daily Bugle to take a formally critical position on Spider-Man appeared several months after the initial sightings, and it was, by the standards of what would follow, restrained. It asked questions rather than making accusations. It raised concerns rather than issuing verdicts. It called, in the measured language of someone who was still making the case rather than delivering the sentence, for some mechanism of accountability, some way for the public to know who this person was and what standards they were being held to and what recourse existed if those standards were not met. The reaction to that editorial was itself instructive. There were letters to the editor, a significant number of them, from readers who agreed entirely with its premise, and who had been waiting for someone with Jameson's platform to articulate what they had been feeling. There were also letters from readers who disagreed, who felt that the editorial missed the point, that the question of Spider-Man's identity was far less important than the question of what he was doing with that identity, and whether it was good for the city. The division of that response mapped, in a rough but recognizable way, onto a division that would persist in New York's relationship with Spider-Man for years to come, between those for whom accountability and transparency were non-negotiable preconditions of legitimate authority, and those for whom the evidence of action and outcome was what mattered, and the mask was simply a practical detail. Jonah Jameson read both sets of letters with the attention he always gave to reader response, and what he took from them confirmed what he had already concluded, not because he ignored the letters that disagreed with him, but because the existence of genuine public unease about Spider-Man's unaccountability felt to him like validation of his decision to raise the issue, regardless of how others chose to resolve it. He was a publisher. His job was to put important questions before the public. That he was putting this particular question before the public, and that a significant portion of the public felt it was an important question, seemed to him sufficient justification for what he had done and sufficient reason to continue. The city continued to watch the skies. The figure in red and blue continued to appear and disappear on its own schedule, answering to no one, helping where it could, vanishing before the applause could properly begin. And in his corner office, with the city spread out beyond his windows and the presses breathing their slow vibration up through the floors beneath his feet, Jonah Jameson continued to form his position, brick by careful brick, into something that would eventually become a wall and that would take far longer to come down than it had taken to build. The wall, as walls tend to do, went up one layer at a time. Looking back across the years from a sufficient distance, it is possible to see the construction clearly, to identify the particular moments and decisions that added height and solidity to what Jameson was building, to understand the process by which a series of reasonable concerns became an unreasonable certainty. But from inside the process, from within the daily life of a newsroom where the publisher's position was simply the weather that everyone worked in, the shift from cautious editorial questioning to sustained institutional campaign happened gradually enough that it was easy to miss the precise moment when one became the other. These things rarely announce themselves. They accumulate the way the pages of a newspaper accumulate across a year, each individual edition unremarkable in itself. The pattern only visible when you step back and look at all of them together. The editorials became more frequent through the latter months of 1962 and into 1963, and as they became more frequent, they also became more confident. The language moving from the conditional register of genuine inquiry into the declarative register of established truth. Where the earliest pieces had asked whether the public ought to be concerned about an unaccountable masked figure operating in its midst, the later ones proceeded from the assumption that the public was right to be concerned and addressed themselves instead to the question of what ought to be done about it. This is a subtle shift, but a significant one. The difference between a newspaper that is exploring a question and a newspaper that has decided what the answer is and is now in the business of persuading its readers to agree. Jameson drove this shift with the same energy and conviction he brought to everything he cared about. Which is to say, with a great deal of both. He was not a passive editorial presence who allowed others to set the direction and then ratified their decisions. He was the kind of publisher who read every word of every edition, who had opinions about headline choices and photograph selections and the placement of stories on the page, who would appear in the press room at unexpected hours and ask direct questions about why a particular piece had been framed in a particular way. His staff were accustomed to this, had built their professional lives around the rhythms of his engagement, and understood that when he felt strongly about a subject, the most efficient path was to feel strongly about it alongside him. On the subject of Spider-Man, as the months passed, he felt very strongly indeed. The arguments that the Bugle advanced in this period were not, it must be said, entirely without foundation. There had been incidents, real incidents with real consequences, that provided legitimate material for concern. A battle between Spider-Man and an early adversary in the warehouse district of Lower Manhattan had left significant structural damage to a building that subsequently required expensive repairs. And the question of who bore financial responsibility for damage caused by superhuman conflicts taking place without official sanction was a genuinely complex one that the legal and insurance frameworks of the time were entirely unprepared to address. A pursuit that had carried Spider-Man and the person he was chasing across several city blocks had resulted in a car being overturned and its occupants briefly trapped. And while they had ultimately been unharmed and Spider-Man had stopped long enough to ensure they were safe before continuing his pursuit, The image of an overturned vehicle on a residential street was not a reassuring one to people who lived on residential streets and preferred to do so without the possibility of becoming incidental casualties of someone else's conflict. Jameson seized on these incidents with the practiced eye of an editor who understood that the strength of a narrative lies not in any single piece of evidence, but in the accumulation of evidence into a pattern. Individual incidents could be explained away or contextualized, or weighed against the genuine good that Spider-Man's interventions produced. A pattern could not be so easily dismissed, and so the Bugle's coverage during this period worked steadily to establish a pattern, to present the incidents of property damage and public disruption, not as the inevitable imperfections of genuinely difficult and unprecedented work, but as evidence of a consistent and predictable recklessness. The natural result of allowing someone with no training, no oversight, and no accountability to operate with the assumption of authority in a densely populated urban environment. The photographs that accompanied these stories deserve attention of their own, because photographs in newspapers do particular work that words cannot quite replicate. A photograph presents itself as simple evidence, as the world as it actually was at a particular moment, and this quality of apparent objectivity gives it a rhetorical power that even the most carefully crafted prose cannot match. The images the Bugle ran alongside its Spider-Man coverage were selected, as all newspaper photographs are selected, from a larger set of available images, and the selection was made by people who understood, consciously or not, what the editorial position required. Spider-Man in motion, caught by a camera at an angle that emphasized the alienness of his posture, clinging to a wall in a way that no human being was supposed to cling to anything, could look heroic or monstrous depending on the framing, the lighting, the caption placed beneath it. The Bugle increasingly chose the frames and the captions that served the narrative it was building. The irony that was invisible to everyone except one young freelance photographer was that some of the most effective of these images were provided by Peter Parker himself. Peter had begun selling his Spider-Man photographs to the Bugle out of financial necessity, arriving in the press room with his camera and his carefully cultivated air of casual availability, and accepting whatever Jameson was willing to pay, which was never as much as the photographs were worth and always accompanied by a speech about the declining standards of photographic evidence for supernatural claims. The photographs were good, genuinely good, because their photographer had advantages that no other photographer in the city could match, and they sold the Bugle's editions reliably and significantly. That the same photographs were being used to construct a case against the person who had taken them, from within the costume that their photographer was wearing at the moment of capture, was a situation of such elaborate irony that it would have been funny if it had not also been, for Peter Parker, a source of considerable and complicated pain. Within the Bugle itself, the intensification of the anti-Spider-Man campaign was not universally embraced, and the most significant source of quiet internal resistance was the paper's city editor, Robbie Robertson. Robertson had been with the Bugle long enough to have developed both a deep loyalty to the institution and a clear-eyed view of its publisher's strengths and limitations. He understood Jameson, understood the genuine integrity that coexisted with the genuine blind spots, and had learned over the years to navigate the space between them with a patience and a diplomatic skill that was itself a form of professional excellence. On the question of Spider-Man, Robertson's instinct was for caution and balance, for coverage that acknowledged the real questions Jameson was raising, while also acknowledging the real good that Spider-Man was doing. He advocated for this position in editorial meetings with the quiet persistence of someone who knows they are unlikely to win the argument, but feels an obligation to make it anyway, and he shaped the coverage that came through his desk with a moderating influence that softened some of the campaign's sharper edges without ever directly challenging its direction. Robertson's reservations were rooted partly in his journalistic ethics. His belief that a newspaper that had decided its conclusion before examining its evidence was failing at the most basic level of its function, and partly in something more personal and more experiential. He had spent his career reporting on communities that had been on the receiving end of institutional power exercised without accountability, and he understood in his bones what it felt like to be told by people in positions of authority that the figure who was actually helping you was a problem to be managed rather than a resource to be valued. He watched Spider-Man's record in the city's poorer neighborhoods, where the hero's interventions were often most frequent and most appreciated, and he found it difficult to square that record with the portrait the Bugle's editorials were painting. He did not say this as loudly or as publicly as he might have, because institutional loyalty and the practical realities of his position constrained him, and this constraint was itself a cost that he bore in the particular private way that principled people bear the cost of compromises they have made for reasons they still believe were sound. The public response to the escalating campaign was more complex and more varied than the Bugle's editorial position acknowledged. Jameson had access to reader mail and circulation data that told him his coverage was popular, that the anti-Spider-Man editorials were among the most read and most responded to content the paper produced. And he interpreted this popularity as validation in the straightforward way that publishers tend to interpret circulation figures. What the mail and the data could not fully capture was the texture of the response, the fact that a significant portion of the readers who engaged most intensely with the Spider-Man coverage were engaging with it in disagreement, were writing letters that took issue with Jameson's premises and conclusions, and that expressed, sometimes politely and sometimes not, the view that the Bugle was wrong about something important. These letters were published because Jameson was a journalist who believed in the letters page as a genuine forum for public debate, but they were published alongside far more letters that agreed with the editorial position, and the overall impression the paper gave of the state of public opinion was one that reflected Jameson's views more than it reflected the genuine division that existed. The effect on Spider-Man's practical operations in the city was real and cumulative. Police officers who might otherwise have developed a working relationship with the hero found it professionally difficult to be seen cooperating with someone that the city's most prominent newspaper was actively campaigning against. City officials who might have moved towards some informal framework of coordination held back, unwilling to position themselves on the wrong side of a controversy that showed no signs of resolving itself. And ordinary citizens, the people on whose behalf Spider-Man was ostensibly operating, absorbed the Bugle's framing in the way that people absorb the frames provided by trusted institutions, not necessarily as absolute truth, but as the background assumption against which they evaluated their own direct experience. The psychological weight of this on Peter Parker, on the person inside the costume who read the editorials and heard the conversations they generated and watched the city's attitude toward his alter ego shift in real time, was something that the campaign's architects could not see and would not have fully credited if they had been told about it. He was a teenager and then a young man, navigating the normal difficulties of that period of life, the pressures of school and then college and then the early career, the losses and the relationships and the gradual and often painful process of becoming whoever he was going to be. On top of all of this, he carried the knowledge that the city he was dedicating himself to protecting had been persuaded, in significant measure, to regard him as a threat. He could not respond to the editorials. He could not write a letter to the Bugle explaining that the publisher was wrong, because any letter he wrote would either reveal his identity or be dismissed as the self-interested complaint of an anonymous masked figure, which was precisely the kind of complaint that Jameson's entire editorial position was designed to preemptively delegitimize. What he could do, and what he did, with a consistency and a patience that said something important about his character, was continue. He continued to appear in the places where he was needed. He continued to help people who needed help, some of whom had perhaps read that morning's Bugle editorial and were ambivalent about accepting assistance from someone their newspaper had called a public menace, and who accepted it anyway because the practical reality of needing help tends to cut through ideological ambivalence fairly efficiently. He continued to show up, and the city continued to need him to show up, and the gap between the Spider-Man that J. Jonah Jameson was writing about in his editorials and the Spider-Man that ordinary New Yorkers were encountering on their streets persisted, quiet and stubborn, as a kind of underground truth that the campaign could suppress but could not entirely eliminate. The crusade was fully underway by the middle years of the decade, its direction set, its language established, its institutional momentum self-sustaining. What had begun as a series of questions had become a conviction, and what had been a conviction had become something very close to a war. The weapons were words and photographs, and the authority of an institution that millions of people trusted to tell them what their city was and what was happening in it. The target was a figure who answered none of these weapons in kind, who continued to operate in the gaps between the Bugle's editions, helping people before the cameras arrived and leaving before the headlines could be written. The city watched both of them, the publisher and the hero, each persistent in their own way, each convinced in their own way that what they were doing was right, and wondered, in the quiet, private way that cities wonder about the dramas playing out within them, how it was all going to end. He came through the door the way young people come through doors when they are trying to appear more confident than they feel, with a deliberate casualness that announces itself as performance to anyone who has been watching people walk through doors for long enough. He was slight and young, with thick-rimmed glasses that he would eventually stop needing, and a camera bag over one shoulder that he held with the particular care of someone for whom the equipment inside it represented a significant financial investment. The press room of the Daily Bugle was not, on the surface, a welcoming environment for a teenage freelancer with no credentials and no appointment. It was loud and purposeful, and full of people who were busy in ways that made their busyness visibly apparent, who moved between desks with the practiced efficiency of people who know exactly where they're going and have strong feelings about anything that might delay them getting there. Peter Parker stood just inside the entrance for a moment, taking the measure of the room, and then walked toward the nearest desk with his careful, considered air of belonging there. The photographs he had brought with him were, by any objective standard, extraordinary. This was not immediately apparent from the manila envelope he pulled from his bag and placed on the desk of the first person willing to pause long enough to look at them, and it was not apparent from his own manner of presenting them, which was studiedly understated, the manner of someone who has been told, or has correctly intuited, that appearing too eager in a room full of journalists is a form of professional self-sabotage. But when the photographs were removed from the envelope and laid out on the desk and looked at properly, the quality that was in them declared itself without any assistance from their photographer. They showed Spider-Man in motion, in ways that no other photographer in the city had managed to capture, from angles that should have been physically impossible to achieve, with a clarity and a dynamic energy that made other photographs of the hero look distant and approximate by comparison. They looked the way photographs look when the person behind the camera was not observing the action from a safe distance, but was somehow inside it, sharing its momentum, present in the way that only participants are present. The reason for this quality was, of course, the most elaborate irony in the history of the Daily Bugle's relationship with Spider-Man. Peter Parker could take photographs of Spider-Man that no other photographer could take because Peter Parker was Spider-Man, and the technical challenge he had solved in order to produce this work was not the challenge of getting close enough to a difficult and mobile subject, but the rather more unusual challenge of photographing himself while simultaneously being himself, which he had managed through a system of small automatic cameras attached to surfaces by his own webbing at carefully calculated angles, triggered by timers he had constructed himself in the workshop space of his home. The resulting images had the authenticity of genuine participation, because they were the products of genuine participation, taken by a camera positioned by the very hands that were also, at the moment of exposure, shooting webs and scaling walls and doing all the other things that made Spider-Man worth photographing in the first place. He had thought about the ethics of this arrangement, because Peter Parker thought about the ethics of most things, and he had arrived at a position that he found defensible if not entirely comfortable. He needed money. The needs were real and immediate and connected to people he loved, to Aunt May's heating bills and the cost of the textbooks required for his courses, and the small but genuine expenses of maintaining his equipment as Spider-Man, the web fluid and the replacement parts for the shooters, and the occasional necessity of an entirely new costume when a previous one had been damaged beyond repair. The photographs were genuinely good photographs that genuinely served the Bugle's commercial interests. That they also served Jay. Jonah Jameson's campaign against Spider-Man was a complication that Peter had looked at carefully before deciding that his financial situation left him with limited alternatives, and that the campaign was going to continue with or without his photographs, and that if someone was going to profit from images of Spider-Man in action, it might as well be Spider-Man himself. This reasoning was sound as far as it went, and the place where it stopped going was a place that Peter tried not to look at too directly, which was the place where he had to acknowledge that the money he was making from the arrangement was made possible precisely by the damage that the arrangement was doing to his own reputation and his own psychological well-being. He was, in a very real sense, funding his own persecution. Every dollar he accepted from Jameson's tight and reluctant hand was a dollar earned by providing the publisher with ammunition for the campaign that made Peter Parker's life, in its Spider-Man dimension, considerably more difficult and considerably more painful than it would otherwise have been. He had looked at this fact and decided to live with it. And living with it required the particular skill of not examining it too closely on the days when it felt most absurd. The first meeting with Jameson himself was not something Peter had been able to avoid, because Jameson was the kind of publisher who involved himself in the acquisition of significant photographic content, and who had very specific opinions about the prices that should be paid for it. He appeared in the press room in the way that he generally appeared everywhere. Suddenly and with volume, a compact and forceful man with a distinctive moustache and an air of perpetual urgency that seemed to be his natural resting state, rather than a response to any particular crisis. He looked at Peter with the rapid, assessing glance of someone who has spent decades evaluating people and things for their professional utility, and has developed great speed and some accuracy in these evaluations, and what his glance communicated was that he was not, on first impression, overwhelmed by what he saw. He was, however, overwhelmed by what Peter had brought him. This was visible in the way his expression changed when he looked at the photographs, a brief, involuntary softening of the habitual severity that told anyone watching that the material had reached him before his professional defences could intercept it. He looked at the photographs for longer than he had intended to look at them, and when he looked up, his first words were not about their quality, which he was not willing to simply concede, but about their provenance, which gave him more room to negotiate. How had the boy gotten so close? What was his relationship with the subject? Had he obtained any kind of signed release or consent from Spider-Man for the use of these images? And if not, what were the legal implications of publishing photographs of a masked individual who had not agreed to be photographed? Peter answered these questions with a patience and a mild ingenuousness that he had discovered, in the brief time he had been navigating the world of adults, was a more effective tool than any form of directness. He had been in the right place at the right time. He had no particular relationship with the subject. He was a photographer, and Spider-Man was a public figure operating in a public space, and the legal situation regarding the photography of public figures in public spaces was, as he understood it, reasonably straightforward. He named a price for the set of photographs. Jameson named a counterprice that was roughly half of Peter's figure, and was delivered with the confident tone of someone making a final offer. Peter, who needed the money, and who had anticipated something like this, accepted without visible distress, which seemed to irritate Jameson slightly, as though he'd been hoping for more resistance and found its absence faintly suspicious. This dynamic, the opening negotiation of what would become one of the more peculiar professional relationships in the history of New York journalism, established a pattern that would persist for years. Jameson would look at Peter's photographs with the involuntary admiration of someone encountering genuine quality, then suppress the admiration and replace it with professional criticism, then offer a price that was too low, then have the offer accepted with equanimity that he found either admirable or irritating depending on his mood, and then publish the photographs with enormous commercial success while paying the person who had taken them as little as he could manage. Peter would accept what was offered, return when he had more photographs, and continue to find the situation both financially necessary and quietly, persistently absurd. What made the arrangement sustainable, beyond the financial necessity that anchored it on Peter's side, and the commercial benefit that anchored it on Jameson's, was the presence of other people in the building whose qualities made it a less hostile environment than the publisher's manner alone would have created. Betty Brant occupied the desk nearest to Jameson's office, from which position she managed the considerable administrative complexity of his professional life, with a competence and a grace that made her indispensable in ways that went well beyond the formal requirements of her role. She was a few years older than Peter, with a quality of self-possession that came from having had to manage real difficulties at a young age, and having managed them successfully enough to emerge with her warmth intact. She was kind to Peter from the beginning, in the specific way of someone who recognizes in another person a certain kind of pressure being quietly borne, and her kindness was not the performed kindness of professional courtesy, but the real thing. Attentive and consistent. Their conversations in the spaces between Peter's visits to sell photographs and collect his payments developed over time into something that provided him with genuine relief from the particular isolation of his double life. He could not tell Betty who he really was or why the Bugle's editorial campaigns affected him in ways that went beyond the ordinary. But he could talk with her about the newspaper and its culture, and the city outside its windows, and she could talk with him about her own life and her concerns for her brother, and the small daily negotiations of working for an employer whose demands were significant, and whose appreciation was inconsistently expressed. In these conversations, conducted across her desk while the press room moved around them, Peter found a quality of human connection that the secretiveness of his other life made difficult to come by, and he valued it accordingly. Robbie Robertson's presence in the building represented something different but equally important. Where Betty provided warmth and human connection, Robertson provided a kind of moral orientation, a consistent example of what it looked like to operate with integrity within an institution that did not always make integrity easy. He was observant in the way that good journalists and good people tend to be observant, noticing things that others missed, and storing what he noticed with a patience that suggested he understood that significance sometimes reveals itself slowly. He noticed Peter Parker, noticed the quality of his photographs and the intelligence behind his apparently guileless manner, and treated him from their first interactions with a respect that was both professionally appropriate and personally meaningful to someone who was accustomed to being underestimated. Robertson never said anything directly to Peter about the anti-Spider-Man coverage and its relationship to the photographs Peter was selling to sustain it. He was too careful and too wise for that kind of directness in a setting where directness had costs. But there was a quality in his manner when the subject came up, a slight dryness, a careful neutrality that was itself a form of communication, that told Peter he was not the only person in the building who found the situation complicated. This was not nothing. In the particular loneliness of Peter's position, the knowledge that someone whose judgment he respected saw the situation with some of the same complexity that he saw it with, was a genuine comfort, even unexpressed and unacknowledged between them. The editorial meetings that shaped the Bugle's coverage during this period were not rooms that Peter was invited into, and the decisions that were made in them were conveyed to him only through the published results. Through the headlines and the editorials and the photograph selections that appeared in each new edition. He read the paper, as he had always read it, because it was the paper his aunt kept in the house, and because it was the paper that employed him, and because, despite everything, it was a good newspaper in the ways that mattered most, thorough and engaged and produced by people who mostly believed in what they were doing. Reading it as someone who was simultaneously its employee, its subject, and its most intimate photographer, required a quality of internal division that he had become expert at maintaining, the same quality of division that allowed him to sit across from Jameson and listen to the publisher's opinions about Spider-Man with an expression of polite neutrality, while the person those opinions were directed at sat behind his eyes and observed the whole situation with a kind of tired, wry recognition. There were days when it was harder than others, days when a particular editorial landed with enough force that the distance between Peter Parker and Spider-Man felt insufficient insulation, when the words Jameson chose reached through the professional arrangement and found the person underneath it, and produced something that was genuinely painful rather than merely absurd. On those days, the walk from the Bugle's building back to the subway and home to Queens was longer than usual, conducted in a silence that had weight to it, a silence full of the things he could not say and the defences he could not make, and the truth he was not able to offer to the person who was confidently and publicly wrong about him. And then there were other days when he arrived with a new envelope of photographs, and Betty greeted him with her particular warmth, and Robertson nodded at him across the press room with the slight considered nod of someone acknowledging a colleague, and Jameson emerged from his office and looked at the new photographs and could not quite suppress the expression that genuine quality produced in him before the professional negotiator reasserted control. On those days the situation seemed less like a wound and more like a puzzle, complex and in some strange way almost interesting, the kind of problem that a scientifically minded person could examine with curiosity rather than only with pain. He was inside something that no one else could see the inside of. He had a perspective on this particular story that was, in the most literal possible sense, unique. And whatever the costs of that perspective, and they were real costs genuinely borne, it was also, in its strange and elaborate way, something remarkable. He settled his payment into his jacket pocket, said goodbye to Betty, exchanged a word with Robertson, and walked back out through the door and into the city that was simultaneously the city he protected, and the city that had been told, by the most authoritative journalistic voice available to it, that he was someone to be feared. Both things were true at once. The door closed behind him, and the press room continued its purposeful noise, and somewhere above the city the web lines were already being calculated, the next patrol already beginning in the back of his mind, patient and necessary and entirely his own. The door that closed behind Peter Parker opened every morning onto a city that was reading about him. This is worth sitting with for a moment, this particular quality of his situation, because it is easy to describe and difficult to truly imagine. Every newsstand he passed on the way to school or to the university, or to wherever the day required him to be displayed the Bugle's front page, and the front page, with a frequency that increased steadily through the middle years of the decade, featured some version of the argument that Jonah Jameson had been refining and amplifying since those first cautious editorials had hardened into conviction. The headlines were not subtle. Jameson had not built his readership through subtlety, and he did not employ it now. Spider-Man, hero, or menace gave way, over time, to constructions that contained rather less genuine uncertainty, that treated the question mark as a rhetorical gesture toward balance, rather than as an honest expression of doubt. The city read these headlines on the subway and over breakfast and during lunch breaks. And the headlines became part of the texture of how New York understood the figure who moved through its nights. To understand how a sustained media campaign shapes public understanding, it helps to think not about any single dramatic moment of persuasion, but about the cumulative effect of repetition across time. No single Bugle editorial converted a Spider-Man admirer into a Spider-Man skeptic in one reading. That is not how the process works. What happened instead was quieter and more gradual, and ultimately more effective than any single dramatic intervention could have been. It was the slow accumulation of a frame. The repeated presentation of Spider-Man within a particular context and through a particular vocabulary, until that context and that vocabulary became the default through which people processed new information about him. When you have read enough times that a figure is a menace, the word begins to arrive before the evidence does. It prepositions the reader. It shapes the question being asked before the question is consciously formed. Jameson understood this. Not necessarily in the analytical terms that a media scholar might use to describe it, but in the instinctive, experiential way of someone who had spent his entire professional life understanding how words work on people. He had used this understanding in service of genuinely important journalism, in the campaigns against corruption and exploitation that had defined the best years of his career, and he was using it now in service of a campaign that was, in its fundamental premises, considerably less well-founded. The techniques were the same, the application was different. And because the techniques were good techniques, wielded by someone who genuinely knew how to use them, the campaign was effective in ways that might not have been possible in less capable hands. The specific accusations that the Bugle levelled against Spider-Man evolved and accumulated across the years of the campaign. Each new wave building on the foundation of what had come before. The earliest editorials, as has been noted, concentrated on the question of accountability and the absence of official authorization. These arguments never went away. They remained a kind of bedrock beneath everything that followed. But they were supplemented over time by more specific and more damaging claims that required the reader to do less philosophical work and produced a more immediate emotional response. Property damage was catalogued with statistical thoroughness, the Bugle maintaining what amounted to a running ledger of the physical destruction attributable to Spider-Man's activities, presented without the countervailing ledger of the crimes prevented and the lives saved that might have provided the reader with a basis for genuine comparative judgment. The ledger existed. The comparison was never invited. The suggestion that Spider-Man might himself be connected to the criminal enterprises he claimed to be fighting was introduced carefully through the technique of the rhetorical question rather than the direct accusation, which provided the Bugle with a degree of legal protection while achieving much of the same rhetorical effect. "Who profits most from Spider-Man's presence in our city?" one editorial asked, and then proceeded to enumerate the ways in which the chaos of superpowered conflict created opportunities for criminal activity in the areas adjacent to its occurrence, never quite stating but strongly implying that someone with intimate knowledge of both sides of the equation might be in a position to exploit this dynamic deliberately. The implication was not supported by evidence because there was no evidence. But the absence of evidence was managed through the technique of treating its absence as itself suspicious, as the natural result of the concealment that a masked criminal would naturally maintain. The photographs that appeared alongside these stories did work that the words described but could not quite accomplish alone. A photograph of Spider-Man on the side of a building, taken from below and at a slight angle that emphasized the strangeness of his posture. The radical impossibility of a human figure adhering to a vertical surface in defiance of the physics that governed every other human body produced in the viewer a visceral sense of wrongness that was difficult to reason away. It was not a monster, this figure, but it was not quite right either. It occupied a category that human perception finds genuinely unsettling, the category of the familiar made strange, the human shape in an inhuman position. This unease was not manufactured by the Bugle. It was a real response to a genuinely unusual thing. But it was selected for, cultivated, presented in preference to the photographs that showed the same figure pulling someone from a burning vehicle or preventing a mugging in a dark street. Images that produced a different and less ambivalent emotional response. Peter Parker's own photographs contributed to this dynamic in ways that he was not always able to fully anticipate, because the editorial decisions about how his images were used were made in rooms he was not part of and by people whose priorities were not his. He would deliver a set of photographs that included images of genuine heroism, alongside the more dramatic and kinetic images of combat and pursuit, and the selection that appeared in the following edition would tend to favour the images that served the existing narrative, the images of destruction and confrontation, and the alien physicality of a figure that defied normal categorization. The heroic images were occasionally published when the news event they documented was too significant to omit, or when a particular story required the appearance of balance. But they were published in a context that had already been established by everything surrounding them, and context in a newspaper, as in most other domains of human communication, shapes meaning in ways that the individual image or statement cannot resist. The effect on Spider-Man's relationship with the New York Police Department during this period was real and practically significant in ways that affected his ability to do the work he had committed himself to doing. The department was an institution with its own internal politics and its own sensitivity to public opinion, and its own complicated relationship with the question of what the Bugle said and what that meant for how the department was perceived. Officers who had developed informal, working relationships with Spider-Man, who had learned to regard his interventions as useful and his presence as generally beneficial to the outcomes they were trying to achieve, found themselves increasingly uncomfortable with the professional visibility of that relationship. The Bugle's campaign had made cooperation with Spider-Man a position that required justification, that had to be defended against the question of why a member of the police department was working alongside someone that the city's most prominent newspaper was calling a criminal associate. Some officers maintained their pragmatic appreciation for what Spider-Man could do regardless of editorial opinion, and these officers represented an important thread of institutional connection that kept the relationship from severing entirely. But others retreated from any appearance of cooperation, and some actively contributed to an adversarial dynamic, treating Spider-Man at the scenes of incidents with a hostility that went beyond professional caution into something more personal, shaped by the daily consumption of a newspaper that had told them with confidence and repetition that their instinct to distrust this figure was the correct instinct. The spread of this attitude through the department was gradual and uneven, but it had cumulative practical consequences. Scenes where Spider-Man had just intervened were sometimes managed in ways that placed obstacles in his path, rather than working alongside him. Situations where his assistance might have been genuinely valuable were handled without it, sometimes with worse outcomes than might otherwise have occurred. Captain George Stacy represented within this institutional dynamic a notable and important exception. He was a man whose professional judgment was respected across the department, whose assessments of complex situations carried weight precisely because they were known to be careful and evidence-based rather than shaped by convenience or pressure. His view of Spider-Man, formed through direct observation and sustained analysis, was considerably more positive than the Bugle's editorial position allowed for, and he expressed this view with the quiet, consistent authority of someone who did not need external validation to feel confident in his conclusions. He did not make a public campaign of his disagreement with Jameson because that was not his style, and because the professional context in which he operated made public controversy about editorial positions unwise. But his influence on those around him, on the officers who respected him, and the officials who consulted him, was a genuine counterweight to the Bugle's institutional pressure, a reminder that the official world was not monolithic in its response to Spider-Man's presence, and that the picture the newspaper was painting was not the only picture that could be drawn from the available evidence. City officials and politicians who found the anti-Spider-Man narrative convenient for their own purposes provided the campaign with an amplification that extended its reach beyond the Bugle's readership. An elected official who wanted to appear tough on the lawlessness of costume vigilantism could reference Jameson's editorials as established public concern rather than as the position of one publisher with an idiosyncratic obsession. A police commissioner who was managing his own institutional pressures could cite the editorial climate as context for a policy of non-cooperation with unregistered masked figures. The Bugle's campaign, by establishing a vocabulary and a framework for a particular kind of civic concern, made it easier for people who might not have felt the concern independently to adopt it, because the adoption now came with a rhetorical infrastructure already in place. The letters page of the Bugle during this period is a document worth reading carefully, because it captures the genuine range of public response that the campaign produced. The range that the editorial pages themselves tended to flatten into a single-voiced civic concern. There were letters from people who felt deeply validated by Jameson's position, who wrote with genuine feeling about their discomfort at the idea of an unaccountable figure operating in their neighborhoods and their gratitude that someone with the platform of the Bugle's publisher was willing to name this discomfort and argue on its behalf. These letters were real expressions of real feeling, and dismissing them because they served Jameson's editorial agenda would be unfair to the people who wrote them. The concern about accountability and the rule of law was, as has been established, a legitimate concern. The fact that Jameson expressed it badly, and in the service of conclusions that went well beyond what the evidence could support, does not mean that everyone who shared elements of his starting position shared the excesses of his conclusion. But there were also letters, many of them, from people who had direct experience of Spider-Man's interventions, and who wrote about that experience with a specificity and an emotional authenticity that the editorial pages of the Bugle rarely gave them adequate space to express. A woman from the Bronx, who wrote about the night a figure in red and blue had pulled her son from a situation that would otherwise have ended very differently. A shopkeeper from Queens who described in precise and grateful detail what had happened when Spider-Man had intervened during a robbery of his store and what it had meant to him and his family. A retired teacher who wrote simply that she had watched Spider-Man stop 3 young men from beating a fourth on the street outside her building, and that she felt safer in her city because of him, and that she wished the Bugle would talk to people like her before deciding what the city thought. These letters arrived at the Bugle and were read, and some of them were published, and they represented, in their aggregate, a body of testimony that complicated the campaign's central narrative in ways that the campaign was never quite able to fully absorb. They were the underground truth that Robbie Robertson understood, and that the editorial position was structured to avoid engaging with directly. They told a story about Spider-Man that was different from the Bugle story, a story drawn not from principle or ideology, but from the specific embodied experience of people who had needed help and received it from an unexpected direction, and who found the newspaper's confident verdict about their benefactor difficult to reconcile with what they had seen with their own eyes. Spider-Man read these responses where he could find them, in the letters that made it into print and in the conversations he overheard during his patrols of the city he was working so hard to protect. He carried them alongside the editorials, alongside Jameson's confident pronouncements, and the police department's increasing coolness, and the political rhetoric that had adopted the Bugle's framework for its own purposes. He carried all of it, the weight of the misrepresentation and the warmth of the gratitude, and he continued to show up in the places where he was needed, because that was what the work required, and because, underneath everything, that was who he was. The campaign could shape how the city talked about him. It could not change what he did when someone needed help. That remained, through all of it, entirely and stubbornly his own. Not everyone in the building agreed with what the building was saying. This is one of the quieter and more important truths about the Daily Bugle's war against Spider-Man. The truth that tends to get lost when the story is told primarily through its most visible and most vocal participant. Institutions are not monolithic, even when they present a monolithic face to the world. Behind the consistent editorial position, behind the headlines and the photograph selections and the op-ed columns that advanced the campaign week after week and year after year, there were individual people with individual consciences and individual assessments of what the evidence actually showed, and the most significant of these individuals, the one whose presence most consistently moderated what the campaign might otherwise have become, sat in the city editor's chair and did his work with a quality of quiet, principled professionalism that deserves far more attention than it typically receives in the telling of this story. Joseph Robertson had come to journalism by a path that was different in almost every particular from the path that had brought Jonah Jameson to the same destination. And these differences of path produced differences of perspective that shaped how each man understood the work they were both committed to doing. Where Jameson's formation had been defined by the particular pressures and opportunities available to a white man of his generation navigating the institutions of mid-century American life, Robertson's had been defined by the experience of navigating those same institutions from a position that those institutions were not designed to accommodate. And this experience had given him a quality of perception that Jameson, for all his genuine intelligence and all his genuine commitment to justice, did not fully possess. Robertson had learned to read situations from multiple angles simultaneously, because his survival in those situations had often depended on his ability to see what the person across the desk from him could not or would not see. This skill, developed in the particular school of adversity that his life had provided, made him an exceptional journalist and an exceptionally careful reader of the dynamics playing out around him. He had grown up in a New York that was, in certain essential respects, a different city from the one that Jameson inhabited. Separated not by geography, but by the invisible and entirely real boundaries that race drew through the shared physical space of the 5 boroughs. He had understood from a young age that the institutions which presented themselves as serving everyone serve some people more completely than others, and that the press, which claimed the function of holding power accountable, was itself a form of power that required holding accountable. These understandings had not made him cynical. That is important to say clearly. Robertson was not a cynical man. He was a realistic one, which is a very different thing. And his realism coexisted with a genuine and sustained idealism about what journalism could be when it was practiced with integrity and courage and genuine commitment to the communities it claimed to serve. His path to the Bugle had taken him through smaller papers and community publications where he had done work that mattered to the specific. Particular people whose lives it documented and whose concerns it represented. He had covered stories that the mainstream press ignored because the people those stories were about occupied positions in the city's social hierarchy that the mainstream press did not regard as sufficiently central to merit sustained attention. He had developed, through this work, a set of relationships in the city's African American communities, in Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant and the neighborhoods of the outer boroughs, that gave him sources and perspectives and a quality of civic understanding that most of his colleagues at the Bugle simply did not have access to. He brought all of this to the city editor's role, and it shaped how he understood Spider-Man's presence and significance in ways that were often quite different from how Jameson understood them. What Robertson saw when he looked at the evidence of Spider-Man's activities across the city was a pattern that the Bugle's editorial coverage systematically failed to represent. The hero's interventions were not evenly distributed across the city's geography. Concentrated in the midtown and downtown areas that tended to generate the most dramatic and most photographable incidents, they extended into the neighborhoods that Robertson knew best, into the communities where the gap between the resources that the police department was willing to deploy and the level of criminal activity that residents were expected to endure was most acute. where a figure who appeared without a badge and without the institutional conditions that governed official intervention filled a space that nothing else was filling. The people in these communities did not, for the most part, write letters to the Bugle about their experiences. But Robertson heard about those experiences through the networks that his years of community journalism had built and maintained. And what he heard was consistent and specific and impossible to square with the portrait the Bugle's editorials were painting. He raised these concerns in editorial meetings because that was the appropriate place to raise them, and because Robertson was a man who raised his concerns in appropriate places rather than around them. He did not do this confrontationally, which would have been both professionally unwise and personally uncharacteristic, but in the careful, evidence-based way of someone who understands that the strongest argument is the one that respects the intelligence of the person it is being made to. He brought examples. He described specific incidents in specific neighborhoods where Spider-Man's intervention had produced specific, documentable good. He asked, in the measured language of a professional raising a professional concern, whether the Bugle's coverage was accurately representing the full picture of what the evidence showed, or whether the editorial position was shaping the coverage selection in ways that would not survive a rigorous application of the journalistic standards that everyone in the room claimed to hold. Jameson's responses to these interventions were themselves revealing of the particular quality of his certainty. He did not dismiss Robertson's evidence. He was too good a journalist to do that, too deeply committed to the principle that evidence matters to simply wave it away. What he did instead was absorb it into his existing framework in the way that people with strong prior beliefs absorb disconfirming evidence, not by revising the framework, but by finding places within it where the new information could be accommodated without requiring fundamental revision. Spider-Man helped people in certain communities Jameson was willing to grant. This did not address the fundamental question of accountability. The good that an unaccountable actor did not legitimize the absence of accountability. If anything, it made the absence more dangerous, because it made the actor more powerful and more trusted, and therefore more capable of harm if the absence of accountability was eventually exploited. This response was not dishonest. It was not Jameson pretending to engage with Robertson's argument while secretly dismissing it. It was the genuine response of someone whose framework was strong enough and flexible enough to absorb the challenge without collapsing, and who experienced the act of absorption as a form of genuine engagement rather than as a form of evasion. This is one of the things that made Jameson's position so durable and so difficult to argue against effectively. It was not a position based on simple ignorance of the counter-evidence. It was a position that had a place for the counter-evidence, a place that kept the counter-evidence from touching the central conviction. Robertson understood this dynamic and had made a kind of peace with it. The peace of someone who has learned that certain conversations are worth having, not because they will produce an immediate change of position, but because they establish a record of dissent that matters in ways that are not always immediately visible. He continued to raise his concerns, in meeting after meeting across the years of the campaign, and he continued to shape the coverage that came through his desk, with the moderating influence available to him, which was real but limited, the influence of someone who can affect the texture of implementation without being able to change the fundamental direction. He made the campaign less extreme than it might otherwise have been. He kept certain kinds of accusations out of print that Jameson in his more heated moments would have been willing to run. He ensured that the letters page published a genuine sample of reader response, rather than a curated selection, that reinforced only the editorial position. These were not small contributions. In an institution where the publisher's personality set the gravitational field that everything else moved within, the ability to maintain an independent centre of moral gravity required a sustained exercise of will and professional skill that most people would have found exhausting and many would have found impossible. Robertson maintained it because he believed in what he was doing and because the alternative, simply going along with the campaign in the name of institutional loyalty or professional self-preservation, was not something that his character allowed him to seriously consider. He had been in situations before where going along was easier and more rewarding than holding his position, and he had learned from those situations at some cost. That the person he was when he held his position was a person he needed to remain. His relationship with Peter Parker was shaped by everything that has just been described, by his capacity for careful observation, and his habit of looking at situations from multiple angles, and his instinct for the kind of intelligence that presents itself as something other than what it is. He noticed, in their early interactions, that Peter was considerably more complex than the eager young freelancer his manner suggested. The photographs were part of this. No one produced photographs of that quality through luck, or through the simple good fortune of proximity. There was an understanding behind them, a relationship with the subject being photographed, that went beyond the accidental. Robertson filed this observation away with the patience he applied to all significant observations, allowing it to inform how he treated Peter without using it to draw conclusions that the available evidence did not support. He was consistently decent to Peter, in the practical ways that decency expresses itself in a professional environment, ensuring that his payments were processed promptly and accurately, intervening quietly on occasions when Jameson's negotiating position had reached a level of unreasonableness that would have been genuinely unfair to a young person without the experience to push back effectively, recommending Peter's work to other editors at the Bugle for occasional additional commissions that supplemented his Spider-Man income with assignments that were less freighted with irony. These acts of consideration were not performed with any expectation of acknowledgement or return. They were simply what Robertson did. The practical expression of his belief that people in positions of relative power within institutions had an obligation to use that power on behalf of people who had less of it. The conversations between them, when they happened, had a quality that both of them valued without either of them being able to fully articulate why. Robertson talked to Peter about journalism and about the city, and about the complicated relationship between institutions and the communities they were supposed to serve. And Peter listened with an attentiveness that was rare in someone his age, and that Robertson found both gratifying and slightly poignant, because the attentiveness had something in it of someone looking for guidance that they could not seek in more direct ways. Peter talked to Robertson about the questions that preoccupied him, about responsibility, and about the difficulty of knowing when to act and when to hold back, and what it meant to try to do good in a world where the consequences of action were never fully predictable. And Robertson listened with the careful attention of someone who recognized in these questions an earnestness that deserved to be taken seriously rather than contextualized into the normal uncertainty of a young person finding their way. Neither of them said anything that gave the other the full picture of what they were actually talking about. These were conversations conducted in a kind of responsible code, both parties saying true things that were less than the whole truth, maintaining the discretion that their respective situations required while still finding, within those constraints, a genuine meeting of minds that was valuable to both of them. Robertson was too good an observer not to have suspicions that went beyond what the available evidence could confirm. Peter was too aware of the risks of revelation to offer Robertson the confirmation that would have resolved those suspicions. The code held, and within its holding a real friendship was quietly built. One of the few relationships in Peter Parker's life that provided him with something like genuine mentorship, without requiring him to sacrifice the privacy on which everything else depended. The conscience of the Bugle sat at its city editor's desk and did its work across the years of the campaign, visible to those who were paying the right kind of attention and invisible to those who only looked at the headlines. It did not stop the campaign. It did not fundamentally alter the direction that Jameson had set, but it kept the institution from becoming something that Robertson would have been unable to recognize as the newspaper he had committed his professional life to. And it kept alive within the daily operations of a place that was saying something wrong about someone who deserved better. The possibility of a different kind of journalism. The possibility was not always realized. But the fact of its persistence, the fact that Robbie Robertson continued to show up every day and do his best to practice what he believed the work required, mattered in ways that are difficult to quantify and impossible to dismiss. There are moments in the life of any sustained obsession when the obsession tips from the merely consuming into the genuinely dangerous, when the energy that has been building behind a conviction finds an outlet that reveals, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, how far the conviction has travelled from its origins in something reasonable and defensible. For J. Jonah Jameson, that moment arrived not in the press room or in the editorial pages of his newspaper, but in a private arrangement made in the quieter corridors of his professional life, an arrangement that would haunt him for years afterward, and that represented in its conception and its consequences the starkest illustration of what happens when a principled man allows his principles to be gradually replaced by something that wears their clothing, but serves a very different purpose. The arrangement had its roots in Jameson's deepening frustration with the limitations of editorial persuasion as a mechanism for achieving what he had come to regard as a necessary outcome. He had been writing about Spider-Man for several years by this point, had brought to the campaign all the considerable force of his personality and his platform, and the hero was still there, still swinging through the streets of his city, still receiving the gratitude of people who had been helped by him, and still generating the kind of public ambivalence that Jameson found increasingly intolerable. The editorials had shaped the conversation. They had moved public opinion in measurable ways. They had made Spider-Man's existence in the city more complicated and more contested than it might otherwise have been. But they had not solved the problem as Jameson understood the problem, which was the continued presence of an unaccountable masked figure in a city that deserved better than to be protected by someone who refused to show his face. He had begun to think, in the way that people who are accustomed to identifying and solving problems begin to think when conventional approaches seem insufficient, about what it would take to actually remove Spider-Man from the equation. The police had proven unable or unwilling to treat him as the criminal that Jameson's editorials insisted he was. The city government had been similarly ineffective, more interested in managing the political complexity of the situation than in resolving it according to the principles that Jameson believed were at stake. If the institutions of legitimate authority were not going to address the problem, then perhaps what was needed was a different kind of solution, one that operated at the level of physical capability rather than editorial persuasion or political pressure. It was in this frame of mind that Jameson encountered Dr. Farley Stillwell, a biologist and researcher whose particular area of expertise was the study of animal behavior and the biological mechanisms through which certain creatures achieved their remarkable physical capabilities. Stillwell was a serious scientist with genuine credentials and a publication record that represented real contributions to his field, but he was also a man whose relationship with the ethical constraints that governed scientific research was, under certain conditions of financial pressure and professional frustration, more flexible than it ought to have been. He had been developing, in the theoretical spaces of his research, ideas about the possibility of transferring the physical characteristics of certain animals to human subjects, of creating, through a process that combined chemical treatment with behavioral conditioning, a human being who possessed the enhanced capabilities of a particular creature, without losing the intelligence and purposefulness that made human beings effective actors in the world. The meeting between Jameson and Stillwell was not accidental. Jameson had been making inquiries, through the informal networks available to someone with his resources and his connections, about the state of research into enhanced human physical capability, and Stillwell's name had come back to him through these inquiries as someone whose work was relevant and whose situation might make him receptive to an unconventional proposal. What Jameson brought to their conversation was money. The resources of a successful publishing enterprise directed toward a private purpose, and a clarity of objective that made the proposal easier to engage with than a more ambiguously motivated commission might have been. He wanted someone capable of matching Spider-Man physically, of confronting and defeating the wall-crawler in direct physical contest. And he was prepared to fund the development of that someone if Stillwell could provide credible assurance that the development was achievable. Stillwell listened. He was not, in that listening, an entirely passive or an entirely innocent party. He understood what was being proposed, understood the purpose to which his research would be put, and chose to proceed because the funding resolved difficulties that had been constraining his work and because the intellectual challenge of the project, the genuine scientific puzzle of what it would take to create an enhanced human operative, engaged the part of him that was a scientist regardless of the ethical complications surrounding the engagement. He asked questions that were partly due diligence and partly genuine scientific inquiry, and the answers he received from Jameson were direct in their statement of purpose and vague in their acknowledgement of the moral complexity involved. Which is the way that people who have decided to do something they would rather not examine too carefully tend to describe their intentions. The subject who was recruited for the enhancement procedure was a man named MacDonald Gargan, a private investigator who had been working for Jameson in a capacity that the publisher preferred not to make public. Gargan had been hired to investigate Peter Parker. To determine whether the young photographer's implausibly excellent Spider-Man photographs indicated some kind of special access to or knowledge of the hero that might be professionally or personally significant. This investigation had not produced the result Jameson was hoping for, which was a definitive explanation for the photographs that would either resolve his suspicions about their provenance or provide him with leverage he could use. What it had produced was a working relationship between Jameson and Gargan that made Gargan the natural candidate for what Jameson had in mind next. Gargan was not a man of great scruple or great imagination. He was practical in the way of people who have spent their professional lives in the grey areas between the legal and the extra-legal, and practical in this context meant willing to consider a proposal if the financial terms were adequate and the risk seemed manageable. The financial terms that Jameson offered were more than adequate. The risk was presented as manageable, in the way that risks are always presented as manageable by people who want something from you, and who have reasons to minimize rather than to fully disclose the dangers involved. Gargan accepted, and the process that would transform him into the Scorpion began. What Stillwell had designed, and what Jameson had funded, was a procedure that used a combination of mutagenic chemicals and a suit of mechanically enhanced armor modeled on the physical characteristics of the Scorpion to produce an operative of extraordinary physical capability. The Scorpion was chosen partly for its predatory efficiency, and partly for the symbolic appropriateness of a creature that was a natural predator of spiders, a logic that appealed to the part of Jameson that had always understood his campaign against Spider-Man in quasi-mythological terms, as a contest between competing symbolic forces rather than merely between a publisher and a masked hero. The procedure was experimental in ways that Stillwell understood more fully than he communicated to either Jameson or Gargan, and the experimental nature of it carried risks that were, in the clinical language of Stillwell's private notes, significant and not fully quantifiable. The transformation of McGargan into the Scorpion was, from a purely technical standpoint, a success. The procedure produced an operative of remarkable physical capability. Faster and stronger than Spider-Man by most measurable standards, armoured against the kinds of impact that would incapacitate an ordinary human being, and equipped with a mechanical tail of considerable destructive power. From every other standpoint, it was an immediate and catastrophic failure that illustrated with painful precision the difference between the creation of physical capability and the maintenance of the psychological stability that makes physical capability useful rather than simply dangerous. The chemical process that enhanced Gargan's physical attributes also affected his mental state in ways that Stillwell had theorized were possible and had chosen to underweight in his communications with Jameson. The mutagenic agents that rewrote the parameters of his physical capability also altered the neurological architecture that governed his impulse control and his capacity for rational decision-making, producing a figure who possessed tremendous physical power and almost no reliable mechanism for determining how and when and against whom that power should be deployed. The Scorpion that emerged from Stillwell's laboratory was not the controlled, purposeful operative that Jameson had envisioned and funded. It was something considerably less controllable and considerably more frightening. A being in the grip of chemical-induced psychological disturbance, whose access to its own considerable strength was unconstrained by the kind of judgment that might have made that strength useful. The first rampage began almost immediately after Gargan's release into operational status, and it bore no resemblance to the targeted, purposeful campaign against Spider-Man that the arrangement had been designed to produce. The Scorpion moved through the city with the blind, chemically amplified fury of someone who has lost the capacity to distinguish between enemies and bystanders, between legitimate targets and innocent people who simply happened to be in the wrong place at a moment when the distinction between those categories no longer registered. People were hurt. Property was destroyed on a scale that dwarfed anything that Spider-Man's most contested interventions had produced. The streets through which the Scorpion moved emptied of ordinary life in the way that streets empty when something is wrong, in a way that bypasses rational assessment and speaks directly to the most ancient and reliable survival instincts. The terrible irony of what followed did not escape Jameson, though he would find, in the immediate aftermath, that the capacity to appreciate irony was considerably diminished by the weight of what he had set in motion. The person who stopped the Scorpion's rampage, who tracked the out-of-control operative through the streets, and eventually brought the situation to a resolution that prevented further harm to innocent people, was Spider-Man. The hero that Jameson had created the Scorpion to destroy was the only figure in the city with the capability to contain the monster that Jameson's obsession had produced. This was not a subtle irony. It was the kind of irony that lands with the weight of a verdict, that arrives not as a gentle complication of the narrative, but as a direct statement about the consequences of certain kinds of certainty taken to certain kinds of extreme. Spider-Man's handling of the Scorpion was not simple or easy or without cost. Gargan was, by most physical measures, more powerful than his opponent, and the chemical disturbance affecting his psychology made him unpredictable in ways that a more rational adversary would not be. The battle ranged across several city blocks and produced its own share of the property damage and public disruption that the Bugle had spent years attributing to Spider-Man's presence, which was another layer of irony that the situation did not need but provided anyway. What Spider-Man brought to the confrontation that the Scorpion could not match was not physical superiority, but the quality of judgment and the capacity for strategic thinking that Gargan's chemical alteration had stripped away. And it was these qualities, together with the peculiar physical advantages that a spider-powered hero possesses against a Scorpion-themed operative in an urban environment, that eventually determined the outcome. Jameson's private reckoning with what he had done began in the hours immediately following the Scorpion's containment and continued with varying intensity for the rest of his life. It was not a simple or a linear process. He was not a man who arrived at self-condemnation easily, or who wore guilt in the visible, expressive way of someone constitutionally suited to remorse. His psychological architecture was not built for the kind of sustained self-examination that the situation arguably warranted. What he experienced was something more like the persistent, uncomfortable knowledge of a person who has made a serious mistake and who must find a way to continue operating in the world with that knowledge as a permanent feature of the landscape. He did not confess publicly. This is the bluntest way to state what is also the most significant fact about his response to the Scorpion episode. He knew what he had done. He knew that his funding and his direction had created a dangerous and damaged person whose rampage had injured innocent people and terrorized a section of his city. He knew that the hero he had spent years campaigning against had been the one to contain the damage. And he kept this knowledge private, in the way that people keep private the things that would most fundamentally undermine the positions they have publicly committed themselves to, managing the guilt through a combination of rationalization and redirection, and the sheer force of continued forward motion that had always been his primary mechanism for managing anything that threatened to slow him down. The rationalization was not without its own internal logic, which is what made it sustainable. He had not intended for Gargan to go out of control. He had acted in what he genuinely believed was the public interest, attempting to create a capability that would address a genuine public safety concern through means that he acknowledged were unconventional. The outcome had been terrible, but outcomes do not always reflect intentions, and a man cannot be held entirely responsible for the unforeseen consequences of actions taken in good faith toward legitimate ends. This reasoning was not entirely without merit. It was also not entirely honest, because the risks had not been entirely unforeseen, because Stillwell had communicated enough about the experimental nature of the process for a careful reader of the information provided to understand that the outcome was not fully predictable, and because Jameson had chosen not to be a careful reader of that information, because careful reading would have complicated a decision he had already made. The Scorpion remained in the world as a consequence of the episode, a figure whose existence was Jameson's responsibility, and whose subsequent criminal career was the downstream result of the publisher's obsession. Gargan did not simply disappear after his initial containment. He continued to operate, continued to be a source of harm and danger, continued to represent the ongoing cost of a decision made in private and never publicly accounted for. Each subsequent appearance of the Scorpion in the city's crime landscape was a reminder, for those who knew the full story, of the gap between the public Jameson who wrote so confidently about accountability and the rule of law, and the private Jameson who had created a monster and declined to account for it. Robbie Robertson knew, not everything, and not immediately, but enough. He was too good a journalist and too careful an observer not to eventually gather the threads of information that, placed alongside each other, pointed toward a conclusion he found profoundly disturbing. He chose not to pursue the story in the way that a different editor at a different paper might have pursued it, and this choice cost him something in his own private accounting, added another entry to the ledger of compromises that institutional loyalty and personal loyalty and the practical realities of his situation required him to make. He raised the matter with Jameson privately, in the direct and non-confrontational way that was his method, and Jameson's response, guarded and unrevealing but not dishonest in the way of someone who has already faced the worst version of the truth about themselves and is no longer frightened of having it named, told Robertson enough to confirm what he already suspected. What had begun as a campaign fought with words had produced, through the compounding logic of obsession, something that words could never have produced on their own. A man had been damaged, people had been hurt, a city had been frightened by something that one of its most prominent citizens had set loose upon it in the name of protecting it. The distance between Jonah Jameson's intentions and Jonah Jameson's consequences had never been wider or more starkly visible, though the visibility was confined to the few people who knew where to look and had sufficient reason to look carefully. The pressroom continued its work, the presses continued their vibration, and at his desk, behind the glass of his corner office, the publisher continued to write about accountability, carrying the knowledge of what that word really cost when you were the one who had failed to live up to it. There is something quietly revealing about the way a person responds to failure. Not the first failure, which tends to produce a relatively straightforward combination of disappointment and recalibration, but the repeated failure, the kind that arrives again and again in the same basic shape, despite all the adjustments and improvements made in response to its previous appearances. The repeated failure tells you something about the nature of the attempt itself, about whether the goal being pursued is genuinely achievable through the means being employed, or whether the means are so fundamentally misaligned with the goal that no amount of refinement will bridge the gap between them. Jonah Jameson's response to the Scorpion disaster was not to step back from the project of physically neutralizing Spider-Man, but to step back from the particular approach that had produced the disaster, to look for a method that could achieve the same outcome without the biological unpredictability that had made Gargan so difficult to control. He found what he was looking for, or believed he had found it, in the cold and controllable precision of machinery. The logic was not unreasonable on its surface. A mechanical system, unlike a chemically altered human being, would not develop psychological instability. It would not go out of control in the ways that Gargan had gone out of control because it would have no psychology to destabilize, no neurological architecture vulnerable to chemical interference, no interior life capable of being overwhelmed by the physical changes imposed upon it. A machine built to find and defeat Spider-Man would do exactly what it was built to do, constrained by its programming rather than by the uncertain governance of a damaged human mind. The appeal of this reasoning to someone with Jameson's particular combination of engineering pragmatism and bitter recent experience was genuine, and it shaped the next phase of his campaign against the wall-crawler with a directness and a clarity of purpose that the Scorpion episode had notably lacked. Spencer Smythe came to Jameson's attention through a process that was, on Smythe's side, entirely deliberate and on Jameson's side structured to feel like discovery. Smythe was a robotics engineer of considerable talent and considerably less professional success than his talent warranted. A combination of personal abrasiveness and institutional bad luck having conspired to place him outside the research environments where his capabilities might have found their fullest expression. He had been developing, in the constrained circumstances of a private laboratory, funded by savings that were not going to last indefinitely, a series of robotic systems that he believed capable of tracking and apprehending the kind of enhanced human subject that conventional law enforcement could not effectively pursue. He had read the Bugle's editorials about Spider-Man with an attention that went beyond ordinary readership, seeing in Jameson's public campaign against the hero not just a political position, but a potential patron whose interests aligned with his own research objectives. The meeting that followed Smythe's approach was one of those professional encounters that both parties enter with agendas they present as something more spontaneous, and in which the pretense of spontaneity is thin enough that both parties are aware of it, but choose, for reasons of mutual convenience, to maintain it anyway. Smythe presented his work with the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting too long for someone capable of appreciating it. Jameson received the presentation with the careful, slightly performative skepticism of someone who's been approached by enthusiastic inventors before and who has learned that enthusiasm is not by itself a reliable guide to practical utility. But the Spider Slayer, as Smythe called his creation, was not the product of mere enthusiasm. It was the product of genuine engineering insight applied to a specific and well-defined problem, and its capabilities, demonstrated in a setting arranged for Jameson's inspection, were real enough to penetrate the skeptical performance and reach the part of the publisher that was still beneath everything, someone who recognized quality when he encountered it. The first Spider Slayer was a substantial machine, remote-controlled, equipped with sensors capable of tracking the specific biological signature of a spider-powered individual, and with manipulator systems capable of restraining a subject of significantly enhanced physical strength. It moved with a deliberateness that was the opposite of Gargan's chemically amplified frenzy, each motion purposeful and controlled and directed by the intelligence at the remote console, rather than by the unpredictable internal weather of a damaged psyche. Jameson watched it move and felt something that was close to optimism, the particular quality of optimism that arrives when a problem that has seemed intractable suddenly acquires what appears to be a viable solution. The feeling was familiar. He had felt it, in different contexts, many times during his journalism career, the moment when a story that had seemed impossible to nail down finally revealed the evidentiary thread that would unravel it. He had learned over the years to distrust this feeling slightly, to hold it at a small distance while submitting the apparent solution to practical testing. But the feeling was there, and it shaped his decision to fund Smythe's work and deploy the first Spider Slayer against its intended target. The deployment did not go as planned, which is a description of what happened that manages to be accurate while significantly understating the completeness of the failure. Spider-Man encountered the first Spider Slayer with a combination of surprise at its existence, genuine concern about its capabilities, and the adaptive intelligence that had always been one of his most reliable advantages in confrontations with technologically sophisticated opponents. He was physically outmatched by the machine in certain specific respects, its strength and its structural durability presenting challenges that his usual approach of speed and agility could not simply circumvent. But he was not outmatched by the thinking behind the machine, which was excellent engineering in service of an incomplete understanding of how Spider-Man actually operated, how he moved and thought and responded to novel threats, the full picture of which was not available to Smythe from the outside, and which Peter Parker, who possessed it completely, was able to exploit with a precision that the machine's programming could not anticipate or adapt to. The defeat of the first Spider Slayer was followed by a period of analysis and refinement on Smythe's part, a systematic identification of the design limitations that the deployment had revealed, and a methodical effort to address each of them in a second generation of the technology. This was the pattern that would persist across years and across multiple iterations of the project. A cycle of deployment and defeat and analysis and improvement that had its own internal logic and its own internal momentum, driven by Smythe's engineering pride and Jameson's persistent conviction, and the particular dynamic between them, which was the dynamic of a patron and a practitioner who shared an objective but whose relationship to that objective was shaped by very different motivations. Jameson's motivation was ideological, in the extended sense of that word that encompasses not just political conviction, but the full complex of beliefs and needs and history that had made the campaign against Spider-Man the defining project of his later career. Each Spider Slayer defeat disappointed him, but the disappointment was manageable because the engineering had been identified as the problem, not the fundamental premise of the project, and the engineering could be improved. The framework of his conviction remained intact even as the specific instruments designed to serve it failed repeatedly, because the framework was not actually dependent on the success of those instruments. He would have continued funding the Spider Slayers even if each successive defeat had been as complete and as decisive as the first, because the project served a purpose beyond the practical purpose of defeating Spider-Man. It served the purpose of demonstrating that the attempt was being made, that the conviction behind the campaign was serious enough to invest in physical action and not merely in words. Smythe's motivation was more purely technical, and this difference in motivation created tensions in their relationship that were managed but never fully resolved across the years of their collaboration. For Smythe, each defeat was primarily an engineering problem to be solved, an indication of specific design inadequacies that the next iteration could address. He took the defeats personally in the way that engineers take the failures of their systems personally, as reflections on their technical capability rather than as setbacks to a moral campaign. His relationship with Jameson was the relationship of a contractor with a demanding client whose specifications kept shifting in response to operational realities that the client was unwilling to fully acknowledge as limitations of the concept rather than of the execution. Jameson wanted a spider slayer that worked. Smythe believed that the reason the spider slayers kept not working was primarily that Spider-Man was harder to defeat than either of them had initially appreciated, and he communicated this belief with increasing directness as the iterations accumulated and the same basic result kept occurring. The Spider Slayers grew more sophisticated across their generations in ways that reflected both the genuine engineering progress Smythe was making and the specific lessons that each deployment taught about the nature of the problem. They became faster, more capable of adapting to their target's movements, better equipped to counter the specific physical advantages that Spider-Man's powers provided. They evolved from the remote-controlled machines of the early iterations toward systems with greater autonomous capability, able to respond to developing situations without waiting for input from a human operator, whose reaction time would inevitably be slower than the real-time demands of combat with a spider-powered adversary. Each design improvement was real. Each deployment failure was also real, generated by capabilities and qualities in Spider-Man that the machines, for all their engineering sophistication, were not able to fully account for. What the machines could not capture, across all their iterations and all their improvements, was the quality that made Spider-Man effective in situations where raw capability and sophisticated programming ought to have been sufficient to defeat him. This quality was not simply physical, not simply the product of his enhanced strength and agility and spider sense, though all of these contributed to it. It was the quality of a person fighting for something that mattered to them, with a degree of personal investment and moral clarity that no machine, however sophisticated, could replicate or fully anticipate. He was not, in these confrontations, simply trying to survive. He was trying to protect a city he loved from harm, including the harm that Jameson's machines were themselves causing in the course of their attempts to stop him. And this motivation produced in him a quality of resourcefulness and a willingness to accept personal cost that the engineering calculations behind the Spider Slayers consistently underestimated. Spider-Man's responses to the Spider Slayers were characterized by the same quality of patient wit that defined his approach to most of the challenges his unusual life presented. He did not enjoy fighting machines designed specifically to defeat him, and the early encounters in particular produced genuine anxiety about the capabilities he was facing, and genuine physical difficulty in finding effective countermeasures against systems built with intimate knowledge of his specific vulnerabilities. But he also found, in the situation, the particular quality of absurdity that his life as Spider-Man regularly produced in abundance. The recognition that he was being hunted by remote-controlled robots funded by the publisher, who was simultaneously paying him for the photographs he took of himself being hunted by those robots. This recognition did not make the robots less dangerous. It made them easier to face with the equanimity that equanimity toward dangerous things always requires some kind of wider perspective to sustain. The later iterations of the Spider Slayer project passed progressively out of Jameson's direct control as Spencer Smythe's health declined under the cumulative physical toll of working with the radioactive materials that certain of his more advanced designs required. The relationship between Smythe and Jameson deteriorated in the final phase of the original engineer's life, as Smythe's physical suffering produced a bitterness that was at least partly directed toward the patron, whose obsession had defined and ultimately consumed the last years of his career. He died having failed to achieve the objective he'd spent those years pursuing, and the cost of that failure in human terms was not a cost that either he or Jameson had adequately accounted for when the project began. Alistair Smythe, Spencer's son, inherited the project in the way that certain burdens are inherited, not through choice but through the combination of love and obligation, an unresolved grief that binds children to the projects their parents died pursuing. He brought to the work a different emotional colouring than his father had brought, darker and more personal, shaped by his father's death and by his own complicated feelings about the man whose commission had defined his father's final years. His spider slayers were the products of this darker motivation, more aggressive in their design philosophy, and less constrained by the engineering conservatism that had kept Spencer's machines within certain boundaries. The cycle of deployment and defeat continued under his stewardship, but the iterations came faster and with a ferocity that reflected the personal rather than merely the technical dimensions of what he was trying to achieve. The cumulative record of the Spider Slayer project across its full history is the record of an obsession expressed in metal and circuitry, a physical monument to the persistence of a conviction that the evidence consistently failed to support. Each machine represented a significant investment of resources and engineering talent and human ambition, and each machine ultimately fell to the same combination of physical capability and moral clarity that the previous machines had fallen to. The machines improved. Spider-Man improved alongside them, learning from each encounter, developing counter-strategies that addressed the specific innovations each new generation introduced. The gap between what the machines could do and what would be required to achieve their objective narrowed in some respects and widened in others, but it never closed. Because the gap was not ultimately a gap between competing mechanical capabilities, but between a system built to defeat a person and a person who had reasons to resist that the system could not measure or account for. Jameson watched the cycle with a patience that said something important about the particular quality of his conviction, its capacity to absorb repeated practical failure without requiring revision of the fundamental premise. He was not a stupid man. He understood at some level that the pattern he was observing had implications for the premise behind the project. But the implications, fully acknowledged, would have required a reckoning that he was not yet ready to undertake, a confrontation with the possibility that the certainty that had driven the campaign from its beginning was not as well founded as he had always believed. The Spider Slayers continued because continuing them was easier than stopping. And stopping would have required the kind of honest self-examination that the pressroom's noise and the editorial deadlines and the perpetual forward motion of a life defined by productivity had always helped him avoid. The machines were built and deployed and defeated, and the presses ran, and the city turned through its seasons, and the figure in red and blue continued to swing through the night, patient and persistent and entirely unwilling to be what Jameson needed him to be. And so the press is quiet, and the city settles into its deep nocturnal breathing, and the story we have been carrying together through all these hours finds its resting place at last. What remains, when the headlines have faded and the editorials have grown still, is something simpler and more durable than any argument either man ever made. It is the truth that conviction and heroism are not always found on opposite sides of a desk, that the people who shape our understanding of the world and the people who protect it are equally human, equally fallible, equally capable of greatness and of error, and that the distance between these things is smaller than it sometimes appears from the outside. Somewhere above a sleeping city, a web line catches the light for just a moment before the darkness receives it. Somewhere in a quiet building, the ghost of ink and purpose lingers in the air like something that was worth every word it cost. Let these images carry you now into the soft geography of sleep, where responsibility rests its shoulders and conviction lays down its certainty, and what remains is only the warmth of stories that remind us we're capable of more than we know. Rest now. The city is watching over you tonight.